Hi, welcome back to another episode of Point and Click Puzzle Games with myself, Angela McCall, whereby we're on a fourth video in our lesson series for Tic Tac Toe and how to build that game. And we are looking at grouping objects and grouping as a technique to create layers so we can control the display of objects and our user interface on our app. So if you haven't been here before, please do subscribe, stay notified, add your comments below, ask me your questions. I dive in 2 or 3 times a week to check on my YouTube channel and any comments that I might have gained. And do bear in mind that this channel is designed for teenagers and adults who have never coded before and are completely green and learning the entire concept and all the different types of coding strategies we are covering in these tutorials. Okay, so we have been designing a tic-tac-toe game whereby so far in the previous tutorials we've created a background image so that we give a nice interface to our app, so it's not just a big old black screen. And then we've created, as a little test, first of all in our first tutorial I think it was, the player's characters, the cross and the naught. And now over the last couple of tutorials we've been learning different coding functions and different strategies and loops and all sorts to be able to create our 9-box grid. So I'm just going to quickly dive on over to my left hand screen and show you where we literally left off in the last video. Now the problem we have right now, and we've been quite lucky because the way that I've coded the game so far is that we've put the code in the order it needs to execute, and so the way the app is currently reading in our code, it is automatically creating the background because that's the first thing that we've done, and then next it's adding on top of that the grid system, which is fine because we have coded it in the order that we want things to execute. But sometimes if our apps get really busy, we need a better, more substantial way of controlling how things are displayed on our screen. So I'm going to create we're going to learn 2 different coding concepts today. It's the same skill, but it's applied in 2 different ways to be able to get the effects that we want. So this is our eye looking across at our mobile app screen. Okay, so we've got a side view presentation at the moment of how things work. Now do excuse the fact that I'm doing this as a whiteboard and things are a little bit skewy, but what we actually need to do is we need to create a group that goes here that acts as our background. When we need to create a group that acts here as our foreground, we need to have another group that acts here. Okay, that's our user interface. Okay, so think about it. This is our eyeball and we are looking at the moment in obviously this direction. As our eye goes through and our code layers up things on our display, we need to load everything in the background first. Then we need to load basically the board game and our controls and any kind of user information that we need them to interact with here. Then we need to add all our buttons and controls that the users play with, because if we put this green group, this user interface, in position 2, in this middle position, then they're going to be hidden behind our board and we're not going to be able to use it. And likewise, we don't want our board being hidden behind the background of our app. So we need to actually create 3 groups, and these groups act as layers. So if you've ever done any kind of graphic design or you've played with images, Photoshop is a brilliant one of this. You've got your layers and you can create groups that you can put all your different images in, and then you can slide those groups above and below, and it basically is layering up all your content. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, think of it as like 3 master groups, which is your background, your foreground and your user interface. Essentially these are the groups and they need to be created in this order, and then basically any objects that we position, depending on the nature of that object, can be positioned into the correct group, and we will always know then that the image, or the object I should say, will live within this section. Now our grid system actually needs to sit inside our foreground because it needs to be above the background but behind any of our user face into buttons. And then we've got our controls, like our actual buttons, which we haven't designed yet, but they will go on in this green layer. This is where things are going to get a little bit funky, because inside this blue layer here, this foreground, we're actually going to need to have 2 other layers. We're actually going to need to have board background and a board foreground. So the reason that we're going to have these two layers is because we want the board to always be positioned behind our players' characters, and our characters always on top, which is why we've got the board background and the board foreground. But we actually need those two boards to work as one sort of unit, as it were, so that we need these to be as one unit so that we can move everything connected with the board up and down on the display in one movement. So first of all, we're going to need to create the groups themselves. So I'm scrolling right up to the top of the screen, and what I'm going to do is, just so that you can understand where to get the syntax, we've gone over to our Corona Labs display here. I'm going to click on the API reference. We've also got all sorts of other types of objects and controls within our Lua programming language, and one of those is called a group object. Now, I've just clicked on that, but there's a guide for group programming, and this group programming guide it's in the graphics, audio and animation section, so you could find it that way. But this has lots of information. Now, it does explain here the coordinate system, which I've kind of covered a little bit in that Lua tutorial that I did a few weeks ago. So please, again, the URL will be in the description below, so go and check that out and familiarise yourself. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're actually going to create groups. And once we've got a group created, we're actually going to insert objects into the group. But the first thing that we've got to do is, if you look down here in the group hierarchy, which is like the layers concept I was just teaching you about, what we're going to actually do is we're going to just copy this kind of concept here, and I'm just going to rewrite it the way that I want it to be on my game. So I'm actually going to start by going to our code. Okay, I am going to go into the create, because it's one of the first things that we need to do before we do anything is to structure our app. So right up in the very first code that I put here is our display groups. Now I'm just going to remove the word local from there, and I'm going to rename these variables, because we are going to need to access these groups at different parts of the entire code. So it needs to be a variable that's local to the scene or the file, but accessible within all the events, which means I do need to actually put the groups up here. So let's call this local. I'm going to call it group, which is my abbreviation background. Okay, and I'm going to call it local group main and local group user interface. So this is our group background. Okay, we've got our group main, so all I'm doing is copy and pasting to replace these names at the moment. And then we've got our group user interface. Okay, our scene doesn't know that they kind of are controlling our environment. So what we actually need to do is we need to add these groups themselves to the main scene of the game. So what we're going to do is we are going to get the scene group, which exists here. Okay, and we're going to basically put a colon and use an insert command like so, and let me copy that because we've got three groups. So I'm going to copy, paste, and then what we're going to insert into the scene is our group main and our group user interface. Now what I've done, so we understand that we've created our groups. Our composer library is very clever at controlling our game, and one of the first things that we've done is that we added the composer library to our file, and then we've created a scene object. Now this scene object is the one that's kind of working behind the scenes to manage our entire app, and in this particular case it's managing this particular file. So it kind of needs to know that these groups are now like the master files that are layering up and controlling our content. So we've had to add these to our event. And again, if you want to learn any more information about this, if you go to the developer guides and goes to user interface scenes in the composer library, and you can see here that it talks about the groups here and why you have to do what you need to do. So there's a lot more reading for you guys to understand this if you need to. Okay, so we now got our groups existing, and now we've created them and inserted them into our scene, so our scene management knows that they exist, which is all good. What we need to do now is we need to actually control some of the things that we've got going on already. So we've already got a background image. Now, if you remember, when we was looking at this new image rectangle, I did say to you, one of the options that you have with creating new objects is that you've got the ability to add it to a parent or a group object. So here is the syntax. Now, on the way that we create it, which we're going to do it as an inline piece of code in this particular example, we can add it to a group. Okay, as part of the command to create that object, we've instantly passed to it all the parameters it needs. Okay, so I'm going to minimize that, come back to our code here, and if you notice, we now want to put this background image, funnily enough, in our background. So I've got our group background name, I'm going to put a comma after it and a space, and I'm going to hit save, and nothing visually at all is going to change from the user's perspective. But in the background of our scene management, we know that we have structured and organised our objects to live in that scene, which means if for any reason we need to delete that group, the composer will now know that that object exists in that group because we've added that group to the scene, and it will tidy up and get rid of all the data that's not being used for us and reallocate it back to the device. So there's a lot going on that you don't physically see with this concept. So it's one of those, that's why I was trying to use my little diagram at the beginning to help you understand, but it is a very powerful thing that you need to get your head around. Now we've got our characters. Now I'm going to come back to those two in a minute because we've got them set as invisible at the moment. So we need to add them to our board. So let's just bring up our display. Okay, so at the moment we've got no user interface, so don't worry about the green, and we've already added our background image to the red, which pretty much is probably the only thing that's going to go in there, to be honest, on a simple app just like this. So pretty much everything that we're going to do now for the rest of this video is going to deal with content that lives in this blue middle layer. For our board management, we're going to need to have two other layers that live within this section only. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but essentially those characters will live in the board foreground because they have to sit on top of our board, otherwise they'll be hidden behind it. We have got our board here, and we are creating these new objects as a grid square, and at the moment they exist physically, we can see them, but as far as the game app and the composer management of our game exists, they are not connected to the scene. So the scene, when we close it, won't know to manage the data that those objects are using. So we need to add them to a group, and it also means that way we can ensure they're always going to be in the correct location. Now we're going to create a group called Group Board, because at the moment I'm going to have other content that's going to go in this middle layer. I am, for the moment, I think, just because I'm not 100% sure where I'm all going to use it all without checking what I've done in my other code, I'm just going to call this as a group. What did I call it? Board Background. And then I'm going to copy that and literally paste there. And I'm going to call it foreground. Okay, all right. So our characters will live in the foreground, and our foreground will live inside the board, and the board will live inside the main. So it's going to get a little bit confusing because we are going to nest concepts. So let's first of all start. We've got our main section going on here. I'm going to cheat and copy and paste, and then we're going to call this group. And as you can see, Visual Studio is trying to guess what we're going to write, so it's quite helpful. Group Foreground, which means my syntax stays nice and neat. And then we are going to copy this line here, and we're going to go down here. We're going to add it twice. We're going to add Group Background, Board Background into our scene group main. Okay, so this is now where things are nesting, and then we obviously want our foreground to always live with our board background. So we are going to put our foreground to live inside our board background. We've added the board to the main layer. So whenever I move this group now, I know that the characters will also be positioned because they're a child object of this parent group. Okay, so things like parents, childs, grandparents, things like that, they are a concept that is often referred to when you nest items inside one another so that you can refer to what you're talking about. So again, that is a concept that's quite familiar across all different programming languages. So at the moment, going back to this particular example, our foreground for our board, our group board foreground, is our child object because it is nested inside and lives inside our board background. And our board background is a child object of the group main. So we've technically got a child, a parent and a grandparent concept going on here. Okay, so that's just one of the ways that we can sort of explain a invisible programming structure in a metaphoric way that pretty much everybody understands the relationships of child's parents and grandparents, people can pick up with and run with real quickly. Now we've got our grouping structures set up properly. What we need to do down here, we can add, as we create, and we're only going to create these here, we're going to, in our options, we can now add in the noughts and the crosses characters into these groups. So as we're literally going to use the same command here as we've got as an insert command. So let me just come down here. Okay, and we are literally going to put character noughts insert into group foreground. Okay, and I'm going to copy that whole line, copy it, and I'm going to put it in here, which means we need to just change character crosses there. So we've now got our character crosses object being inserted into the group board foreground. Okay, so now we know our characters live where they're meant to live. We have also created squares, so we also need to add these to groups. So what I'm basically doing is, by the time we're finished, we would have gone all the way down through, and any display objects will now be living in its appropriate groups. But we do have this object, a display object here, without a parent, without a home, but we're going to add in the group object now. So I can literally, in line code, add in here the, let me just create a space, group and board background, and there you can see. Now what I've done is, as I start to type, Visual Studio is trying to sort of predict what it is that I'm going to finish writing, so it's providing suggestions. And I always advocate, when you're in this situation, then click on the correct variable name, because it just means you're not using any typos and there's no room for human error because you've typed it once somewhere else. The Studio text editor knows the name exists, and so it's trying to prompt you, and it just means that you aren't going to end up accidentally misspelling something. Okay, so I'm going to hit save. So now what we've got is, although we can't see anything visually different, the structure and organisation that's going on behind the scenes in memory is a lot more organised for us. Okay, now what it means is I can change this group board. Okay, and I can change its location. So if I was to say it's Y, let's move it down about 50 pixels. So whatever it is at the moment when we create the group, we can put it as, let's say, wherever it is now, plus, because we're going to move it down. Remember, it's the LUA coordinate system that we're using, not the Cartesian. So we're going to, anything that's going sort of moving in a southward direction means it's going to be a positive number. So we've put positive, let's move it 100 just for the moment, and I'm going to hit save. Now, if everything goes to plan, our entire grid has just moved as one object. So technically it is one object now. The group board background variable that we've just created, this one here, is technically an object. So we've just moved it as an object down all the way through by 100 pixels. Now we need to test the foreground. Now, although we have got our characters up here inside the create event, they will have to move in due course, because if you think of the logic of what is happening as the code comes onto the screen, okay, we're going to create all the objects that we need to create, like the background and all of these sort of groups and things that are going on, all the background maintenance. Then we're going to populate what will show on screen, which is why we're designing our board here now. But we don't actually use the characters until the entire board is on the screen. So really, these characters need to live down here in that show section. So what I'm going to just do for the moment, just so they're in the right position on our code, in the sort of executional position that they should live in, I am just going to put them down here. We've now got everything where it needs to be. And remember, the reason that we can use these groups and access them in any part of our code is because we actually created the variables outside any of the events, okay? Which means anything as a child can access anything that lives in the parent, okay? Which is why our variables are living outside of our scene events, so that any scene can basically use it. Okay, let's now just turn these to true so we can actually see our characters. Okay, and let's see what's happening with them at the moment, where they're being positioned. Okay, so they are there, but I think they are behind the board still. So even though we've told them to put them in this board, we just need to make sure that this board is definitely to the front and the background is definitely at the back. Okay, so one way to just double check that everything is being positioned at the back and the front respectively is we can force the group, anything that goes into the group background, to go to the back, and I'll show you where in the Corona Labs code in a second you can find that. And likewise, we want the group foreground, anything in the group foreground, to always be to the front, she says. There we go. I'm going to hit save. And again, this is an invisible concept that we are learning. Let's just quickly grab over here into our display library. Doesn't matter which object. In fact, actually, let's just go up here and put to back as a command and search. When you do that in the Corona Labs, it uses Google's search engine, if I remember rightly. These bits above the line are generally adverts, so just ignore them. But if you look down here, to back as a display object is what we're after. There we've got our display object. It's a type of command and things that we can do inside the API reference, the library for the display. We've got an object to front, which is our code here. So we've got our object, which is our group, and we've sent it to the back. And then likewise, you've got to front, and then we've got our object to front. So it doesn't just work on objects, it can work on groups as well. So we're back on our board here. So we've made sure that the groups themselves are front and back, but we are still missing our characters. Okay, so one of the other things that we could do as a little tweak, just to see if everything is actually on screen, is as the squares are created, for the moment, I'm just going to turn them invisible. So is visible. There we go. I've already used it, so it's coming up, and I'm going to put that as equal to false. Okay, and I'm going to save. So when I reload it now, there we go. So we do know the characters are actually being displayed. They're just in the wrong order, so we can't see them, but they do physically show. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to put in here grid squares, because it could be the squares themselves that are sitting in front. So we're going to put grid squares, and we're going to put colon to back, because we definitely always want them at the back. And when we actually create the characters themselves down here, I'm going to make sure that these objects themselves are also set to front. Okay, so I'm literally forcing the group management, and I'm forcing the object managements themselves to work the way I want them to work. So let me just save that. Again, nothing is going to have changed because we've got our grid hidden. But if I was to change this now to true, to show we can show those grid squares, there we go. So up here we had this the parameters hidden in these variables here. We can see very clearly that we've told the noughts to display in the center of the screen, both vertically and horizontally, and the same for the crosses, which is why they're overlapping. But as you can see, they're not in the center of the screen. The center of the screen is where my cursor is right now. But because we've now placed them inside the group foreground, and the group foreground lives inside the board background, when we actually move the board backgrounds on the y-axis, so we can move it south by 100 pixels, it moved it and its child group, which is the foreground, and that's where these objects live. So everything moved as one united item. So again, that's kind of quite a complex concept that we have covered today. So we've done the whole to and back and to front. We forced it on objects and layers, objects themselves. We've put objects inside of groups, we've put groups inside of groups, and we've got this physical hierarchy system going on right now. Hope you kind of followed me on that concept. Please do subscribe, stay notified, add your comments below if you've got any questions. I know there's quite a lot involved with this. I would definitely suggest that you go and look for my other YouTube tutorial on the coordinate system, the LUA coordinate system, because we've dealt with it quite heavily again in this episode today. And that's kind of it from me today. So please be sure to join us on the next video, which is when we are going to pimp up, shall we say, some of the object displays going on at the moment. So just a nice easy one after this heavy tutorial today.